with the roll call vote on the president's nomination already underway. The economy and jobs will be at the center of this Trump campaign, as it was for him in 2016. And to give us his appraisal of the president's record, we welcome now Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of American Action Forum and former director of the Congressional Budget Office. So, Doug, welcome. It's good to have you here to set this up for us. Give us your sense. President Trump said he was going to be the jobs president. He was going to really return growth. How successful was he in the first 4 years?
I think he was very successful in the first 2 years. If you look at the overall performance of the economy, measured by, say, year-over-year growth rates, there was a low point in the second quarter of 2016, and then from the moment the president is inaugurated straight through the second quarter of 2018, it accelerates and gets to a high of 3.3% year-over-year. At that point, things start to tail off, and at least to my eye, the front end is a tribute to the deregulation, dramatic change in regulatory policies, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed in 2017. But the tail off is due to him picking a major trade war with China, a real slowdown in the global economy, China-U.S. world trading system. And the question is whether people will penalize him for that, or, as a lot of polls indicate, they support his trade policies. And so that's really just one record of uninterrupted success despite the slowdown in the overall economy.
Well, so before we get to some of the struggles, let's talk about the successes. Sure. Deregulation, is it just almost undeniable that there was real success with deregulation? And what does that really return to the economy? Can we really put numbers around that?
It's very hard to put numbers on that. We've tried to do that at the American Action Forum. But, you know, to give you a sense of the magnitudes, a major regulation in the United States is something that costs more than $100 million for the private sector to comply with. The Obama administration finalized a major regulation at an average rate of 1.1 per day, every day for 8 years, a total self-reported cost of compliance of $890 billion. Just over $100 billion a year in stealth taxes on the private sector. The president was inaugurated and gets to the end of the first fiscal year, and he's imposed $5 billion in regulatory costs. Just a dead stop in the regulatory burden. Second fiscal year, negative, about $15 billion. Third, about flat. You know, just night and day from the Obama era. I don't know how to quantify the impact on GDP, but there's no question if you look at the confidence surveys in the small business world or CEO confidence early in his administration, that change in the regulatory structure was an enormous help to the U.S. economy. I think that's something that was little recognized at the time, and in retrospect looks really important.
Doug, you also mentioned the tax cuts that came along in 2017. We got the tax cuts. It gave us some boost. How much boost did it give us? Can you approximate that in terms of GDP? And how much did it cost? Because it also didn't come cheap.
Certainly didn't come cheap. It was $2 trillion in budget cost over the first 10 years. But it contained some important structural reforms that were agreed upon on a bipartisan basis before the election. The U.S. corporation income tax had a rate that was too high. It had a base that was too worldwide. It had to be transformed into a more European-style corporation income tax to be competitive. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did that. It also cut the top rate, provided some benefits to working families. So taken as a whole, it had some real short-run stimulus effects and some important structural changes to the corporate world. I think those are a big impact. You can get between the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and some of the budget deals early in 2018, you can easily get something that looks like 0.6, 0.7 of a percentage point increase in growth.
Doug, you also mentioned the trade war, if I can call it that, with China. The disputes we have that are ongoing, they don't seem to be getting better right now. In fact, President Trump has not been very explicit with what his agenda for the second term is, but the one thing he said is we're going to get even tougher with China. What does that hold for the U.S. economy if he follows through on that, if he's elected?
I think, taken at face value, the trade negotiations, the tit for tat, the sort of series of showdowns that the president engaged in hurt the U.S. economy, hurt the Chinese economy as well, hurt the global economy on the whole. So I think a repeat of that is actually not a plus from just the mechanics of trying to get investment growth and a restoration of full employment. On the other hand, people give him credit for confronting China. China's a known bad actor. Previous efforts by Bush administration, Obama administration had not yielded anything, really. And so he gets credit for doing that, even though I think it was a negative from the point of view of maintaining the momentum he had built in the U.S. economy.
So Doug, we've had this discussion so far without the pandemic into effect, which is the right way to do it. At the same time, we do have a pandemic now, which has really brought the U.S. economy to a screeching halt in large part. Can you really assess President Trump's economic performance without assessing his performance on the pandemic?
You can't. And the economic policies in the pandemic are inseparable from the public health policies, because in the end, we know the roots of the recession were a dramatic drop in household consumption, an unprecedented drop that occurred between mid and late March. And it was largely that relatively affluent households stopped spending on personal services that involve contact with other individuals. So, no more restaurants, no more travel, no more hotels, no more recreation. That drop-off really triggered this tremendous downturn. That's a public health thing. That's a fear of going out and being in contact. And I think the voters are going to have to decide whether his efforts on the public health front were sufficient and did, in fact, do everything they could to restore safety to the extent possible, because that's inseparable from giving people a check and then having them say, well, I will or will not go out and spend this. I mean, you just can't take those apart. And so I think you should expect to see the Democrats talk a lot about his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, because it is an economic policy issue.
So finally, Doug, give the president some advice now as he looks toward an agenda for a second possible term. What's the one thing you'd like to see him do that would really fundamentally help the U.S. economy?
Well, I think he should make a real commitment to stabilizing the debt. He was, I think, correct in pursuing the tax bill despite its deficit. I think on balance that was going to be helpful for the U.S. economy. I think he has been correct to preside over a dramatic response to the pandemic. The CARES bill at 10% of GDP is unprecedented in U.S. history. But I think he would be incorrect to say we don't have to worry about it and I don't need a plan. I think he should be saying something that gives people confidence that by the end of his second 4 years, the U.S. financial house is in order and that he can hand the baton to the next generation safely.
Okay, thank you so much, Doug. Always a pleasure to have you with us. That's Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He's president of the American Action Forum, and as he's been